Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 3, Chapter 3, entitled Never Going Back. In the following months during Izuku's training, new aspects of his original quirk came to light. When Yagi had said that One for All was strengthening State of Mind, neither of them realized by how much it would do so. It was too much at first, and took time and practice alongside One for All to become accustomed to. Izuku could now sense the life force of any living thing. He couldn't see it exactly, but he could feel it, kind of like how most people can tell when someone is watching them, except it was even stronger than that. Yagi tested it after 1 month by bringing in his old mentor Gran Torino. What he could see, though, as long as he was in direct line of sight with someone, was their will, almost like an aura. At first, that aspect was really frustrating as he couldn't turn it on and off, and it caused him to get intense headaches and strained the muscles in his eyes. But eventually he got used to it, and learned to kind of ignore it for the most part. It was 1 month before the entrance exam for UA, and Izuku still felt woefully underprepared. The morning that he was set to meet Gran Torino, Izuku was nervous, and woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. He drank a cup of extra strong coffee and ate a bowl of oatmeal before heading out, dressed in a different pair of Galaxy leggings, this time with neon pink shorts over them. His t-shirt this time just said Lost in Thought. He had gotten it from a nearby shop on sale, and it was the fabric he liked. Very breathable and soft. Plus, the color of it was what most would call a putrid yellow. Izuku really enjoyed dressing in so many clashing bright colors. They soothed him. For the meeting with Gran Torino, they thought it would be best to be in a contained area, so Yagi had rented a gym and waited for the two there. Gran Torino arrived first, and his old mentor leveled a steady gaze at him, his expression annoyingly unreadable. "I hope you know what you're doing, boy," were the first things he said to All Might in person in years. Yagi grimaced. "I have not made a mistake, of that I am sure. Izuku is a brilliant boy, every bit as brave and as strong as you could hope. More." Yagi looked toward the door of the gym. "I am grateful that he is in my life. He is better than I could have ever hoped, and he's going to be an amazing hero." Gran Torino huffed, but didn't say anything. Soon enough, the boy in question walked in through the double gym doors. Gran made a noise of astonishment. "What is that kid wearing?" Yagi simply smiled. "Bright colors make him happy." Gran made a face, but Izuku had approached them now, and they were standing. "Hello, I'm Midoriya Izuku." This wasn't the introduction Gran Torino would have wanted, but according to Toshi, the boy needed all the training he could get. He had said that he had a pretty good natural control of One for All, and it was actually what attaining One for All had done to his original quirk that he was mostly struggling with. "Tell me about State of Mind," Gran told the boy in response. He already knew his name anyway. "Yagi didn't tell you." Izuku glanced at the hero next to Gran's side, who shrugged. "I want to hear it from you," Gran answered. "I know the basics from Toshi, but how did One for All change it?" "Oh," Izuku scratched the back of his neck absently. "It enhanced it." "Obviously," Gran sighed. "I can see auras now, and I can sense people," he muttered. "Are you asking me or are you telling me?" Gran said firmly, and the boy flinched, crossing his arms across his ribs. "Telling." He glanced back over to Yagi. Something must have helped, though, because he took a deep breath and stood up straighter. "My quirk causes migraines and headaches. I pretty much have a headache 100% of the time. The intensity of the headache differs, though, and now I can put larger things into my Mindscape without hurting myself as much. I haven't tried anything alive yet since the sludge villain." Gran raised a brow. Despite the boy's obvious anxieties and fears in this situation, he was persevering and giving Gran a good rundown of his quirk. He glanced at Toshi out of the corner of his eye. The man was grinning. Gran sighed and faced the boy. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Izuku frowned. "What?" Gran shook his head. "Send me to your Mindscape." The boy's eyes widened into saucers, and next to him Yagi stiffened. Even he had never asked to see it, despite his curiosity. "I need to see what I have to work with, boy." Izuku considered it. He hadn't accidentally destroyed anything since he had melted that glass, and at the time, he hadn't exactly been in a calm state of mind. At the moment he felt okay for the most part, calm if not a little bit anxious. After a moment, he nodded to the small hero and began removing the glove from his right hand. Gran Torino settled himself as Yagi watched on attentively. Izuku stepped forward, a strange expression on his face, and then he reached forward as if to shake his hand. With a steady breath, Gran replicated the gesture, his hand closing around the boy's. For being in the glove, it was surprisingly cold. Gran's stomach plummeted, as if the ground had dropped away. His feet hit solid ground, and he stumbled before catching his balance. The ground beneath him was soft and plush, the grass even and green. Wildflowers in so many different colors grew all around him, and cherry blossoms blew across the entire area with a soft wind. Gran looked around. This field seemed to go on forever, with cherry blossom trees dotted here and there. From somewhere he could hear the sound of water running, but he couldn't see any evidence of a brook or creek. Above him the sky was darkening and thick clouds were rapidly moving in, as if the wind was much faster where they were. Gran wondered how that worked, if the weather was a direct representation of the boy's mental state. Before Gran truly had the chance to discover more, he was yanked back, barely landing on his feet right next to the boy, who was standing rock still, his chest barely moving as Toshi crouched in front of him, hands on his shoulders, eyes staring into Midoriya's. "You need to breathe, Izuku." Gran watched from the spot he had landed as Toshi squeezed the boy's shoulder, his fingers twitching at his sides as if he were resisting the urge to do something with them. It wasn't quite a panic attack, but it was something along those lines. Yagi had watched as his successor had taken his mentor's hand and blipped him out of existence, with the distinct sound of something heavy ripping. Immediately the boy had gone ramrod straight, eyes widening. "Izuku?" Yagi had stepped forward in his concern. Izuku had met his eyes and swallowed thickly. His mouth opened and closed as if he was struggling to speak. Yagi walked forward, grasping the boy's shoulders. "Bring him back," he told him, concerned that if he got into a full-blown panic attack, something would happen to Gran Torino. Izuku nodded and lifted a shaking hand. Gran was swiftly deposited next to them, and Yagi focused on helping Izuku, helping him regain control of his breathing. It didn't take too long this time, before Izuku was pulling deep, if not a little shaky, breaths into his chest and exhaling almost evenly. "Better?" Yagi asked. Izuku nodded shakily, blushing. "Sorry." "Don't be," he told him, patting his shoulder gently. "What happened?" Gran Torino approached the two of them. Izuku looked at his shoes with embarrassment. He cleared his throat. It's hard to explain." "Try," Gran responded, not unkindly. Izuku's brow furrowed. "I haven't taken many people. Just my mom and that monster." Izuku frowned, his fingers picking at the end of his shirt. The glove was back on his hand. "It didn't hurt or anything. It was just—" His mouth twisted slightly. "It just felt like a violation, I guess." Izuku shook his head, seemingly irritated with his inability to form the right words. "It's just not something I'm used to." Gran nodded, eyes narrowed in thought. "It makes sense. We'll practice with it. In the meantime, I have several ideas for how to help. The first step, meditation." 3 weeks went by, and then it was only 1 week until the entrance exam. Today was Izuku's last meeting with Gran Torino. They had been practicing with both of Izuku's quirks, and Izuku felt like he had an adequate handle on them. For the first time in his life, Izuku actually felt confident in his body and even his mind. He hadn't had a panic attack since that last one with Gran. His meds were working. His nightmares had even been tame lately. Izuku knew it wouldn't last, but he was riding this high while it lasted. He met Yagi and Gran at the same gym they had started in. Today he was wearing bright blue athletic pants that had a white stripe going down the side of each leg, and a plain black t-shirt with a picture of a fox on it. Today, Izuku would be sending both Yagi and Gran into his Mindscape at the same time. He entered the gym with warring feelings of excitement and anxiety. Half an hour later found the three of them sitting in a circle, the two adults watching Izuku remove his gloves. Izuku met Yagi's eyes, and the man gave him a reassuring smile. "You can do it, my boy." Izuku smiled. That's what he needed to hear. "Are you guys ready?" They nodded. "You're clear on what you need to do," Gran verified with the boy. Izuku nodded. "I'm going to keep you in there for either as long as I can stay calm while also practicing on the dummies, or for an hour, whichever comes first." Gran nodded, settling in. "Here we go." Izuku murmured under his breath before stretching his arms out, his hands bare. Yagi and Gran both took a deep breath and then allowed Izuku to take their hands. Yagi was prepared for a number of things, but it still took him by surprise when he was hit with the intense feeling of vertigo, like he had crested the biggest hill on a roller coaster and was dropping in a free fall. He managed to stay upright as his feet hit solid ground. Next to him, Gran Torino remained upright as well, and they glanced at each other, making sure the other was all right. With that, Yagi finally looked around at his successor's Mindscape for the first time. He was struck by the beauty of it. They were on a hill overlooking an ever-ending sea of flora. The grass was not green but blue, and the wildflowers scattered amidst the grass were every color imaginable. The sky was a warm, comforting yellow, clear of rain clouds or darkness. The air was fresh and crisp, and felt cleansing as Yagi breathed. "It wasn't like this before," Gran murmured, and Yagi glanced at him. His old mentor was looking around in barely restrained awe. "It's beautiful." Yagi looked back at the expanse of the field before him. He was interrupted by Gran making a short grunt as he bent down to pick something up that seemed to be half buried in the dirt that Yagi had just noticed appeared to be red. "What's that?" the hero asked, edging closer to see whatever was in Gran's hands. Gran held it out to him with a strange look on his face. Yagi took it, turning it in his hands. It was a small figurine of All Might. Yagi felt a smile tugging at his mouth before he turned the figurine on its side and caught sight of the red mark coating one of the sharp edges of the figurine. Yagi frowned, smoothing his thumb over it. The trademark date on the foot said it was about a decade old, and it was a one-of-a-kind item. Izuku would have been about 4 when he got this. Yagi wondered with dread what had happened for blood to get on it. He pocketed it without thinking about it. Gran had already moved on, walking down the hill. He wondered how much stuff Izuku stored in his Mindscape. He wondered what those things meant to him that would cause him to hide them in a place where they could potentially be destroyed. Yagi went after Gran, still taking in the beauty of the entire area. The sight of it all only made him care about Izuku all the more. Meanwhile, back at the gym, Izuku was practicing with the dummies. At first, when he had sent the 2 away, he had been almost debilitated by the feeling of wrongness that came from within. He'd managed to fight that feeling down with relative ease, though, and had set to practice his hand-to-hand combat. By the time Izuku's phone alarm had gone off, signaling an hour had passed, Izuku had almost forgotten that Gran and Yagi were literally in his mind. He had grown so familiar with Yagi lately, and trusted him so much that he was surprised to note it did not bother him at all. Hours of meditation and fighting practice with Gran had him pretty comfortable with the man for the most part as well, and eventually the familiar feelings of their auras had just faded into the back of his mind. His mind. Izuku walked over to his phone and silenced the alarm before sitting down cross-legged on the floor of the gym. He held his hands out to help him focus and concentrated on the desire to have his mentors, his friends, back with him. There was a tug of pain in his head, and then came that ripping sound, doubled this time. He gasped as it felt like that tug of pain in his head ripped as well, spreading to envelop his whole head. He groaned, leaning forward to rest his forehead against the cool floor of the gym. "Are you all right, my boy?" came Yagi's voice. "Give me a minute, please," Izuku whispered, eyes clenched shut, forehead wrinkled. A hand came up to rub small circles on his back, while the green-haired boy recovered. He breathed deeply and steadily through his mouth. After several minutes, Izuku sat back up, rolling his shoulders. "What happened?" Gran asked sternly, from where he was sitting in front of him. "I brought you back, and my brain caught on fire," Izuku whined. Yagi snorted from beside him. "Did us actually being there cause you any pain or stress?" Yagi asked, his voice calming. Izuku didn't trust himself not to throw up if he shook his head, so instead he said, "No, it was fine. After a bit I practically forgot you guys were even there." "Interesting," Gran mumbled, tapping his chin. "I think it's because I know you both. I'm very familiar with how your auras feel when you're around me," Izuku explained. His headache was fading into a more tolerable roar, and he straightened. "It's more difficult with someone I don't know, with an aura that is unknown to me." "Such as when we first met," Gran added on his own. "Yeah," Izuku answered. "I think that's probably enough for today. You should get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow, young Izuku," Yagi said, watching Izuku sway slightly as he stood. He steadied himself before smiling at the 2 of them, then gathering his things and heading out the gym doors toward home. The hero and the retired hero leveled a solemn gaze at each other, recalling what else they had found, deeper in Izuku's mindscape. The next week went by too quickly, and Izuku was left to lay in his bed the night before the exam. His fingers were interlocked over his stomach as he lay on his back, looking up at the dark ceiling. He was so tired, but his heart was racing at the thought of the exam tomorrow. He was anxious, and his head was moving too quickly. He wanted to text Yagi, but didn't want to wake him up. The hero had to be up just as early, if not earlier, for the exams as well, and if Izuku impeded his sleep, he would feel really bad. Izuku rolled onto his side. The silence of the empty apartment was echoing around him, stretching. He felt so alone. Izuku got up and grabbed his Bluetooth headphones from his bag by the door. He shoved them into his ears and slid back into his bed and under the thin cover. He scooted over to where his phone was charging and turned on his sleeping playlist. He curled into a ball and closed his eyes, determined to get at least a little sleep. Eventually it seemed to work because Izuku found himself waking up with a yelp when the alarm sounded straight into his ears. He lurched forward, quickly dismissing the alarm and collapsing back into bed, his face buried in his pillow. One step at a time. Coffee and medicine first. Yeah, he could do that. An hour later found Izuku on the train to UA. He was standing, leaning against the bar, bobbing his head gently to music. He was trying to stay calm, keep his heart rate down. He didn't know what the practical exam was going to be. No one did, though a lot of people on the forum speculated that it would be against the teachers of UA, and if that was the case, Izuku needed to make sure his mind was relatively calm, in case he needed to send a living person there. Izuku spent the rest of the ride doing breathing exercises that Gran Torino had taught him, and before long, the train arrived, and then soon after, he was walking toward the school of his dreams. Of course he had to screw it up. He had always been clumsy. Before he could smash his face against the concrete at the UA entrance, he felt a hand slap his arm, and he was very suddenly, much so, not touching the ground. His feet pedaled instinctively as he glanced around. A short, mousy, brown-haired girl stood next to him. She released, before apologizing for using her quirk on him. She rushed away before he could say anything, and he watched her back, frowning. He was disconcerted that a stranger had bothered to help him, but he shook his head clear, straightened his back, and headed inside. The written exam was easy. After all, Izuku spent almost all of his free time studying. After that, they headed to a different hall where Present Mike would be presenting the rules of the practical exam to them. Of course, Kachan was seated next to him. Izuku resisted the urge to shrink into his seat, instead focusing on keeping control of his breathing. He made what dialogue he felt he had to with Kachan, all while trying not to freak out. Even now, despite how far he had progressed, just the sight or the sound of the explosive boy made Izuku feel like he was going to have an anxiety attack. He was glad that they weren't going to be in the same testing arena. After Present Mike's, presentation, they were all sent to their respective testing arenas. He was receiving a few odd looks, but he supposed it was probably because of the contrasting difference between his facial expression and his clothes. He wore a similar outfit to what he usually wore when he went training, galaxy print leggings with another pair of neon shorts over them. This time they were purple. He wore a tighter shirt this time so that the fabric wouldn't get in his way. It was a bright blue shirt with a rainbow on it. All that plus the bright red shoes made a bright outfit which contrasted sharply with the bags under his eyes and scarred, muscled arms. Oh well, Izuku could ignore what other people thought if he focused on the robots. How was he going to take them down? Currently, the more he used One for All, the more his body ached, the power pushing his bones and muscles to the limits. His hands flexed and unflexed at his sides while he thought, the countdown timer sounding around him. He could use One for All a little, but he couldn't rely on it. He would have to use State of Mind at some point, but he couldn't put all of them in his mindscape. Even just one would probably be headache-causing. He would have to... That was it. A thin, evil grin spread across his face. The two people nearest him, upon catching sight of that smile, carefully edged away. He would have to destroy the robots with State of Mind, and to do that, he needed to let everything in. The timer was nearing its end as Izuku pulled off his gloves, tucking them into the waistband of his shorts. He took a deep breath, cracking his neck. People around him were whispering, mostly about nonsense, but he caught some of the looks people gave him. He thought about his mom, whom he hadn't seen since his last birthday, his mom who had effectively abandoned him. He thought about his dad and everything he had done. Izuku thought of all the things that hurt him, all the anxiety that usually hindered him, and he allowed it to cover his mind in darkness, in pain, and death. The buzzer sounded, and they all ran forward. Izuku kept his hands close to him at first, careful not to touch anyone. His eyes were narrowed, his heart near bursting in his chest, and his breath erratic. He rushed forward until he came on his first robot, split off from the rest of the group. He ducked under an attack it threw at him, and he slapped a hand against its side. He heard the world rip and felt as if it was deposited into his mindscape. He felt it being destroyed by the pain he kept inside. Within seconds, he had dropped a pile of melted, bent metal on the ground and raced on. Up in the observation booth, Present Mike and Yagi were both gaping at the video screen that was following Midoriya as he tore across the testing arena, leaving pounds of destroyed robots in his wake. He was using a combination of One for All and his original quirk, and he was utterly decimating the arena. After a moment of watching this, Nezu leaned back, giving All Might a look. In return, the blonde just shrugged before looking back at the monitor. 2 minutes! Present Mike screamed across the arena as Izuku delivered a superpowered punch at a one-pointer. It flew backward and into a building, destroying it and the building. Run! Someone screamed from behind the boy, and Izuku bodily flinched as the tall, well-built guy passed, his hand brushing against Izuku's arm. Izuku's control on his panic slipped, and he leaned against a block of concrete, clutching his chest. People were yelling and running around him as the zero-pointer charged them at what was probably its max speed. Wait! Help! A high-pitched voice screamed from the direction of the zero-pointer. Izuku lifted his head, and through his tunnel vision he caught sight of the girl that had saved him from breaking his face before the exam had even started. Choking down his panic was a feat all on its own, but Izuku managed to throw himself forward. There wasn't time to get to the girl, remove the block pinning her, and move her out of the way, so Izuku did the first thing he could think of. He jumped forward and propelled himself off of a fallen pillar as if it were a springboard in gymnastics. His legs shrieked at him, not broken but near it. He flew toward the robot, green lightning dancing across his skin. He could smell the ozone as if it was oozing from his pores, and his nose wrinkled. Izuku reached the robot and threw his fist toward it. It slammed into its front and rocked backward, destroyed. Izuku felt the skin on his knuckles split, and the pressure from the punch reverberated up his arm. And then he was falling, and he watched the ground approaching with detachment. Was he really going to pancake himself after everything? A slap across his face had him freezing in midair, and he turned his head. It was the girl from before, the one he had just saved. With a pained expression, she put her fingertips together, releasing them both. Izuku hit the ground with a grunt. He stayed in the awkward position that he had fallen in. The pain had surpassed migraine at this point, and he wondered how he was still conscious. He didn't know what the state of the rest of his body was, because all there was his head. His vision had turned almost completely black by this point, and he was pretty certain that his brain was acid sludge in his skull. A voice sounded nearby, but he couldn't make out the words over the sound of blood rushing in his ear. Something touched his forehead, and there was sweet relief as his eyes rolled back into his head. Back in the observation booth, Eraserhead and Present Mike sat side by side, replaying the footage of the green-haired boy. Present Mike was cackling with glee. That boy doesn't know when to stop. Aizawa was scowling at the footage. He's going to be in my class, isn't he? It wasn't a question. He certainly is, Nezu answered from behind him, chuckling maniacally. Aizawa sighed heavily. 1 week later, and Izuku was checking the mail after a run, as he always did. This time, though, inside there was a letter, very obviously from UA. Izuku grabbed it, running up the apartment steps into his apartment. He threw open the door, slamming it against the wall. He tore off his shoes, closed the door, and raced to his room. He slipped to his knees, legs on either side of him as he ripped the envelope in half in his excitement. A disc of metal clattered to the floor and activated, bathing his bedroom in light. Izuku's eyes widened as the figure of All Might announced that he had gotten the first place in the entrance exam with a mixed rescue points and combat points combined, with one of the highest scores on the practical exam. This is your Hero Academia. The light went away, and Izuku didn't move, barely even breathing. Tears filled his eyes as he considered where he was only a year ago. He tipped forward until his forehead was against the ground as sobs broke free from his chest. His hands clenched his shirt over his heart. Everything he had gone through, all the pain and the heartache, everything he had to do to get here. Izuku Midoriya was going to be a hero. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 3 of State of Mind. Chapter 4 will be up next. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions to this one. I really like how the author wrote the entrance exam for this fic, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions as well. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.